Have you ever wondered what it truly costs to possess your own thoughts? What price a human being pays to own the words inside their own mind? There was a man. His name was Solomon, and the masters of Ashford Plantation in Mississippi believed they owned everything about him. His hands, his sweat, his silence. They believed they owned even the darkness behind his eyes when he closed them at night. They laughed at Solomon, called him the Mute One, said his mind was as empty as a dried well. For 17 years he let them believe this. 17 years of bowed heads and shuffled feet. 17 years of swallowed words and hidden fire. But Solomon carried a secret so dangerous that if discovered, it would mean his death. A secret scratched into the dirt at midnight. A secret whispered to the moths that circled his single candle. A secret that would eventually bring the most powerful family in Warren County to their knees. If you want to discover what happens when the powerless find power in the most unexpected place, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button because this channel uncovers the stories they tried to bury. The stories that deserve to be heard. What Solomon did with 26 letters of the alphabet. It still echoes today. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will never look at a simple piece of paper the same way again. The ruins still stand. If you drive down the old river road outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, past the gas station with the rusted Coca-Cola sign, past the church with the crooked steeple, you will find them. Crumbling columns wrapped in kudzu vine. A chimney stack pointing at the sky like a blackened finger. The earth there smells different. Older. Heavier. As if the ground itself remembers what it witnessed. They call it Ashford Place now. The Historical Society put up a small marker in 1987. The marker mentions the architectural significance of the antebellum structure. It mentions the family who built it. It does not mention Solomon. It does not mention the letter. It does not mention the night the truth finally screamed loud enough for the whole nation to hear. But the oak tree remembers. The one they called the Judgment Oak, where Overseer Cornelius Whitmore conducted his public corrections. Its bark still carries the scars of chains. Its roots still drink from soil that absorbed generations of tears. And if you press your ear against its trunk on certain autumn evenings, the old folks say you can hear something. A scratching sound. Like a quill on paper. Like a man writing his way to freedom. This is not simply a story about reading and writing. This is a story about what happens when they steal your voice and you build a new one from scratch. This is a story about the most dangerous weapon ever forged. Not a gun, not a blade. 26 letters arranged in the right order. This is the story of Solomon Ashford, who was never supposed to exist in history, and the letter that made sure he always would. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single investigation. Ashford Plantation spread across 3,200 acres of Mississippi bottomland in Warren County. The main house rose 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming like teeth against the green wilderness. 16 windows faced the river, 16 eyes watching the boats that carried cotton downstream to New Orleans and brought fine furniture upstream from Memphis. The plantation operated like a small kingdom. At its peak, 247 enslaved people lived and labored within its boundaries. They planted cotton. They harvested cotton. They ginned cotton. Their fingers bled for cotton. Their backs bent for cotton. Their children were born into cotton and their elders died surrounded by it. Master Reginald Ashford III inherited the property in 1842. He was 31 years old, educated at the University of Virginia, fond of quoting Greek philosophers he only half understood. He kept a library of over 400 books in the east wing of the main house. Leather-bound volumes with gold lettering. Shakespeare. Milton. The complete works of Sir Walter Scott. He often said that books were the mark of civilization, that literacy separated man from beast. The irony of this statement, given what he did to preserve illiteracy among those he enslaved, would later become the central theme of newspaper editorials across the northern states. Mississippi law at this time made teaching an enslaved person to read or write a criminal offense. The penalty ranged from fines to imprisonment. For the enslaved person caught learning, the punishment fell under the master's discretion. This discretion, at Ashford Plantation, took creative and terrible forms. Overseer Cornelius Whitmore enforced the literacy prohibition with particular enthusiasm. A tall man with pale eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his chin, Whitmore had served in the Texas Rangers before taking the overseer position. He claimed the scar came from a Comanche arrow. Others whispered it came from a barroom fight in Natchez after he was caught cheating at cards. Regardless of its origin, that scar twisted when he smiled, which he did most often while administering punishment. The workday at Ashford began before sunrise. A bell mounted on a post near the cotton house rang at 4:30 in the morning during picking season. Workers had 15 minutes to reach the fields. Those who arrived late received 5 lashes for every minute of tardiness. Whitmore kept a pocket watch specifically for this purpose, a gold timepiece he claimed to have won from a riverboat gambler. He liked to hold it up, letting the workers watch the second hand sweep toward their fate. Cotton-picking quotas at Ashford ran higher than neighboring plantations. Adult men were expected to harvest 200 pounds per day. Women faced a quota of 150 pounds. Children as young as 7 years old were required to pick 50 pounds. The cotton was weighed every evening at the gin house. Whitmore stood beside the scales with his ledger book, recording numbers, calculating shortfalls, assigning punishments. The quarters where enslaved people lived sat a quarter mile from the main house, deliberately positioned downwind. 23 cabins, each approximately 14 feet by 16 feet, each housing between 4 and 8 people, depending on family configurations. The floors were packed dirt. The walls were rough-hewn logs with mud and moss filling the gaps. In winter, frost crept through those gaps and settled on sleeping children. In summer, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, thick and inescapable. Solomon lived in cabin number 7 with his mother Esther until her death in 1849. After that, he lived alone. This was unusual. Overseers typically assign new occupants to single-person cabins to maximize efficiency. But Solomon had proven himself useful in ways that granted small privileges, not enough to matter, just enough to notice. He worked as a blacksmith. This position held particular importance on a plantation the size of Ashford. Horses needed shoes, tools needed repair, chains needed mending. The last duty carried its own dark weight that Solomon never discussed, not even in the letter that would later make him famous. Some silences run too deep for words. The blacksmith shop stood between the cotton gin and the stables, a sturdy structure of brick and timber built to contain the fires necessary for the work. Solomon spent his days in this space, surrounded by heat and iron, and the ringing percussion of hammer on anvil. The sound carried across the plantation like a heartbeat, steady and constant, marking time in a place where time meant only more labor, more pain, more distance from anything resembling freedom. Master Ashford visited the blacksmith shop occasionally. He fancied himself a man of practical knowledge and enjoyed watching skilled work, though he would never lower himself to perform any. During these visits, he sometimes brought guests from neighboring plantations or business associates from Vicksburg. He would gesture toward Solomon working the bellows or shaping a horseshoe and say, with the casual cruelty of absolute ownership, "Observe the creature in his natural state. Strong as an ox, simple as one too. Give him fire and metal and he's content as a child with a toy." Solomon would continue working, eyes down, face blank, hammer rising and falling in its ancient rhythm. He had perfected this mask over many years. The mask of emptiness, the mask of simple contentment, the mask that hid a mind that was anything but simple, anything but content. The other workers at Ashford knew Solomon as a quiet man, dependable, skilled with his hands, good with horses, who seemed to sense something calm in him and stood steady under his touch. He helped when he could, sharing food during lean times, fashioning small tools that made field work slightly less brutal. The old folks respected him. The children were not afraid of him. This was as close to status as an enslaved person could achieve without attracting dangerous attention. But there was something else, something that set Solomon apart in ways that even his closest acquaintances only dimly perceived. When he looked at things, he looked differently. His eyes moved in patterns that didn't match the patterns of labor. They tracked across surfaces. They lingered on shapes. They studied details that had no practical application to blacksmith work, or cotton harvest, or survival. He looked at the world the way someone looks at something they are trying to memorize. Solomon's mother, Esther, came from a place she called the Water Country in her native tongue. She was captured at 14 years old from a village near the Bight of Benin and survived the Middle Passage in the hold of a ship called the Mercy, a name whose bitter irony needs no elaboration. She was sold 3 times before arriving at Ashford Plantation in 1824, purchased for $600 and a bay mare that had gone lame. Esther was considered valuable for her strong constitution and her skill with indigo dye, though indigo cultivation had declined in Mississippi by this time. Master Ashford's father kept her employed in the laundry, where her knowledge of colors and fabrics proved useful for maintaining the household linens and the family's fine clothing. She gave birth to Solomon in the winter of 1826. The father was never acknowledged, a silence that Esther maintained until her death. Some suspected one of the white overseers. Others noted that the oldest Ashford son, Theodore, had shown particular interest in the laundry building during the spring of 1825. The truth, whatever it was, went with Esther to her grave. What she gave Solomon before she died was more valuable than any inheritance of blood or name. She gave him hunger. Not the hunger of the body, which was a constant companion anyway. The hunger of the mind. The burning need to know what was contained in the marks on paper that the white folks guarded so jealously. They fear it, Esther told her son, when he was young enough that she could still hold him on her lap. They were sitting behind cabin 7 in the narrow strip of time between evening meal and enforced darkness. The stars were emerging, pricking through the purple sky like holes poked in a black cloth with light behind it. Fear what, Mama? The knowing, the reading and the writing. They fear it more than they fear rebellion, more than they fear poison in their food or fire in their barns. Because a person who can read, Solomon, that person can never be fully owned. Part of them will always be free, a part they cannot reach or beat or sell away. She traced shapes in the dirt with her finger, shapes that Solomon didn't recognize. This is how my grandmother wrote our family name, in the old country. Before everything. She studied the marks she had made, then swept her palm across them, erasing them back into undifferentiated earth. I cannot read the white man's writing, but I remember these, and someday, when you know their letters, you will make these marks mean something again. Solomon never forgot this moment. Years later, writing the letter that would change everything, he would begin with those very shapes his mother had drawn in the dirt. A dedication, a promise kept across decades, but that was later. First came the long years of careful, dangerous learning. The person who taught Solomon to read was not who anyone might expect. It was not a sympathetic white person moved by abolition sentiment. It was not a fellow enslaved person who had somehow acquired the forbidden knowledge. It was a dead man, or rather, the possessions of a dead man. In the spring of 1839, when Solomon was 13 years old, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Warren County. The disease killed indiscriminately, ignoring the boundaries between big house and slave quarters, though the enslaved, weakened by inadequate nutrition and housing, died in greater numbers as usual. Ashford Plantation lost 43 people that spring. Among them was a tutor named Oliver Hicks, a young man from Connecticut who had come south seeking employment and found death instead. Hicks had been hired to educate the Ashford children, Theodore Jr., Elizabeth, and young William. He lived in a small room above the schoolhouse, a detached building on the east side of the property. When the fever took him, his possessions were considered contaminated. Master Ashford ordered everything burned, but the enslaved man assigned to this task, an old field hand named Jupiter, could not bring himself to burn books. He didn't know what they said. He couldn't read a single word. But he knew they were precious. He knew the white folks valued them above almost everything else. So instead of burning them, he hid them in an abandoned root cellar behind the oldest oak tree on the property. Jupiter died of the same fever 3 days later. His secret should have died with him. But Solomon had seen. He had been delivering a repaired harness to the stables when he observed Jupiter carrying an armful of books toward the tree line instead of toward the bonfire. Curiosity, that dangerous quality that Esther had unknowingly nurtured, drove Solomon to follow at a distance. He watched Jupiter descend into the root cellar. He watched him emerge empty-handed. He watched him walk away, never knowing he had been observed. Solomon waited 2 months before investigating. Caution was essential. The consequences of discovery would be severe, possibly fatal. But eventually, on a moonless night in July, he crept to the abandoned cellar and descended into darkness. 23 books. Some damaged by moisture, their pages swollen and stuck together, but others remained readable. A primer designed for young children, with simple words paired with illustrations. A grammar text that explained the rules governing how words combined into sentences. A collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Solomon would not understand for years, but would eventually treasure above all the others. Several novels, a book of poetry, a King James Bible, and something else, something that would prove equally important. A stack of student copybooks, pages filled with the careful handwriting of Theodore Jr. and Elizabeth Ashford, as they practiced their letters. Uppercase A, lowercase a. Uppercase B, lowercase b. Row after row of repetition. Solomon had found his teachers. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The process of teaching himself to read and write took Solomon nearly 6 years. He could only study on the darkest nights, when overseers were less likely to patrol. He could only study for short periods, because exhaustion from the day's labor made concentration difficult, and because he needed to burn his single candle sparingly. He could only practice writing by scratching letters in the dirt floor of his cabin, then smoothing them away before dawn. The primer was his foundation. A is for apple. B is for ball. Simple correspondences between sounds and symbols, designed for white children who would learn openly, praised for their progress, rewarded for their success. Solomon had none of these advantages. He had only stolen books and stolen time, and the burning will his mother had given him. The process was agonizingly slow. Some nights he made no progress at all, staring at a word he could not decipher, until his candle guttered and left him in darkness. Other nights something would click, a connection would form, and he would feel a rush of triumph that he had to suppress into silence, joy being as dangerous as knowledge in a place where both were forbidden. He made mistakes constantly. Without a teacher to correct him, errors became habit before he could identify them. He pronounced words incorrectly in his mind, creating sounds that bore no relation to how the white folks actually spoke them. He misunderstood grammar rules and wrote sentences that a properly educated reader would recognize as malformed. But he persisted, night after night, month after month, year after year. By 1845, when Solomon was 19 years old, he could read at roughly the level of an 8-year-old white child. By 1848, he had progressed to approximately 12-year-old level. By 1851, the year his mother died, he was reading Emerson's essays and understanding most of what the philosopher meant. Writing developed more slowly. Reading requires recognition. Writing requires production. Solomon had no paper. He could not risk acquiring any, because paper was tracked and accounted for on a plantation where every resource had value. He practiced forming letters in the air above his bed, moving his finger through darkness, imagining ink flowing where there was only empty space. He practiced words in his mind while working the forge, reciting their spelling silently as the hammer rose and fell. He assigned letters to the rhythm. Capital S, small o, small l, small o, small m, small o, small n. His own name, spelled and respelled 1,000 times until it was etched into his brain, deeper than any brand they could burn into his flesh. The question of what to do with this knowledge plagued Solomon for years. Reading for its own sake provided some comfort. He could escape into the pages of Sir Walter Scott, traveling to castles and battles in countries he would never see. He could lose himself in the Bible's promises, even as he questioned why God seemed to have abandoned his people in bondage. He could struggle with Emerson's ideas about self-reliance and individual worth, ideas that seemed to presume a freedom of choice that Solomon had never possessed. But these were private pleasures, secret rebellions of the mind that changed nothing in the material world. The cotton still needed picking. The horseshoes still needed making. The hierarchy of power still pressed down with its full weight. What Solomon needed was a way to make the words work, a way to transform his hidden knowledge into actual change. The opportunity came in a form he could never have anticipated. The winter of 1853 brought a visitor to Ashford Plantation. His name was James Harrington, a businessman from Cincinnati who had interests in river commerce and had traveled south to discuss shipping arrangements with Master Ashford. He brought with him a personal servant, a free black man named William Still, who wore fine clothes and carried himself with a quiet dignity that disturbed everyone who saw him, white and black alike. Free black people were rare in Mississippi, and their presence was viewed with suspicion. They represented a contradiction, a proof that darkness of skin did not inherently require lightness of freedom. Master Ashford tolerated William's presence because he valued Harrington's business, but he made sure to keep the free man away from his own enslaved people. Contamination, he called it, the contamination of dangerous ideas. But Solomon found ways to observe William from a distance. He watched how the man moved, how he spoke, how he met white men's eyes without the constant deference that enslaved people learned as survival. He watched, and he wondered about the life this man led, a life where reading and writing were skills openly possessed, openly practiced, openly used. The visit lasted 2 weeks. During that time, Solomon gathered information the way a squirrel gathers nuts before winter, carefully, steadily, with complete attention to not being caught. He learned that Harrington's business involved moving goods along the Ohio River. He learned that the Ohio River formed the boundary between slave states and free states. He learned that Cincinnati, where Harrington lived, was just across that river from Kentucky, which was slave territory. He learned that free black people in Cincinnati had established communities, churches, schools. He learned that some of them worked to help enslaved people escape. This last piece of information came not from observation, but from overhearing. Solomon had brought a repaired fire poker to the main house kitchen when he heard 2 of the household workers whispering about William. "They say he knows people," one whispered. "People who help folks get away." "Hush your mouth," the other replied. "Talk like that gets you sold south." Solomon filed this knowledge away with all the other knowledge he had accumulated. He did not yet see how to use it, but he knew that information was power. His mother had taught him this. The letters themselves had taught him this. Every scrap of knowledge was a tool waiting for the right moment of application. What Solomon did not know, what he could not know, was that James Harrington would visit Ashford Plantation again, and the second visit would change everything. The years between 1853 and 1858 brought changes to Ashford Plantation, none of them good for those who labored there. Master Reginald Ashford III died of apoplexy in April 1855, collapsing at his own dinner table during a meal celebrating his daughter Elizabeth's engagement to a planter from Natchez. He was 44 years old. He had spent his life accumulating wealth built on the bodies of enslaved people. His obituary in the Vicksburg Whig called him a gentleman of the old school, possessed of learning and refinement. His son Theodore inherited everything: the land, the house, the business interests, and the human beings classified as property. Theodore was 28 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a temperament markedly different from his father's. Where Reginald had maintained a veneer of civilized detachment from the violence that sustained his wealth, Theodore embraced it. He took personal pleasure in watching punishments administered. He visited the quarters at night, in ways that left young women hollow-eyed and silent. He drank heavily and grew volatile under alcohol's influence, which was most of the time. Theodore also harbored a particular hatred for any sign of intelligence or capability among the enslaved people. His father had valued skilled workers like Solomon, seeing them as investments worth protecting. Theodore saw them as threats. "A smart Negro is a dangerous Negro," he declared at a gathering of neighboring planters shortly after assuming control. "Give them too much ability, and they start thinking they deserve things. Better to keep them dumb and scared." He began implementing policies designed to break the spirit of anyone who showed signs of independent thought. Punishments increased in frequency and severity. Privileges that the elder Ashford had allowed, such as small garden plots or occasional permission to hire out for extra work, were revoked. The atmosphere on the plantation shifted from oppressive to suffocating. Solomon understood immediately that his position had become more precarious. His skill at blacksmithing had protected him under the old master. Under Theodore, it might mark him for destruction. He became even more careful about concealing his abilities. He adopted a slower manner of speech, as if each word required tremendous effort to produce. He allowed himself to make small mistakes in his work, enough to seem fallible without being negligent. He kept his eyes down so consistently that some of the newer arrivals at the plantation assumed he was partially blind, but the books were still there, hidden in their root cellar, and at night, in the darkness of his cabin, Solomon continued to read, continued to think, continued to prepare for a moment he could feel approaching, like a storm building beyond the horizon. The storm arrived in the person of Cornelius Whitmore's replacement. Overseer Whitmore died in a manner that some called accident and others called judgment. He was inspecting the cotton gin machinery in September 1856 when his coat sleeve caught in the gears. By the time workers shut down the mechanism, his right arm had been destroyed beyond any hope of repair. The wound turned septic within days. He died screaming for whiskey and cursing everyone around him. His replacement was a man named Samuel Briggs, and he was worse. Briggs came from a plantation in Alabama, where he had earned a reputation for producing high cotton yields through methods other overseers found excessive. He believed in what he called scientific management, a system of measurement and punishment calculated to extract maximum labor through minimum cost. Every action was tracked. Every shortfall was punished. Every enslaved person was reduced to numbers in his ledger book. Pounds picked, lashes administered, days lost to illness, monetary value remaining. He kept these records meticulously. He kept records of everything. He was a man who believed that writing things down gave him power over them, a belief that would prove dramatically ironic, given how this story ends. Solomon watched Briggs establish his regime with a mixture of fear and fascination. The fear was reasonable. Briggs's methods were brutal, and his attention to detail meant that nothing escaped his notice. The fascination came from the ledgers themselves. Solomon had never seen his own people reduced to columns of figures, never witnessed the cold arithmetic of human bondage laid out so explicitly. Briggs kept his primary ledger in the overseer's house, a small building adjacent to the cotton gin. But he also kept a pocket journal that never left his person, a leather-bound notebook where he recorded daily observations and calculated punishments owed. Solomon began to observe Briggs the way he had once observed Jupiter with the books, patient and careful, looking for patterns, looking for vulnerabilities, looking for information that might someday prove useful. He learned that Briggs was a creature of habit. He took his evening meal at exactly 6 o'clock. He walked the quarters at 8 o'clock to ensure everyone was inside. He retired to his house at 9 o'clock, where he spent approximately 1 hour updating his ledgers before extinguishing his lamp. He learned that Briggs was feared but not respected. Other white employees of the plantation disliked him. The neighboring planters considered his methods extreme. Even Theodore Ashford, no humanitarian himself, occasionally expressed discomfort with Briggs's systematic cruelty. Most importantly, he learned that Briggs corresponded regularly with someone in Montgomery, Alabama. Letters arrived and departed monthly. The content of these letters was unknown, but their existence suggested connections, networks, information flowing in and out of Ashford Plantation through channels that might be exploited. The event that set everything in motion occurred on a March evening in 1858. A young woman named Lucy had been accused of stealing food from the main house kitchen. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best. A missing ham. Her proximity to the kitchen. The word of a household worker who disliked her. In a fair system, such evidence would have warranted investigation, not immediate conviction. But this was not a fair system. This was Ashford Plantation under Theodore Ashford and Samuel Briggs. The punishment was set for the following Sunday, after church services that the white family attended, and the enslaved people were required to observe from a distance. Sunday punishments were a specialty of Briggs's, his way of ensuring that the Christian message of obedience was reinforced with physical demonstration. Lucy was 17 years old. She had arrived at Ashford 3 years earlier, purchased from an estate sale in Natchez. Her mother had been sold separately to a buyer from Texas. Her father was unknown. She worked in the fields during planting and harvest, in the laundry during slow seasons. She was small and quiet, and had done nothing to draw attention to herself until the missing ham. The punishment Briggs announced was 40 lashes, an extreme sentence for a first offense of theft, even a proven one. This number was calculated, Solomon understood, to serve as a warning to everyone. The ham's value was perhaps $2. Lucy's lesson would be written across her back in scars that would last until she died. Solomon had no particular connection to Lucy. They had exchanged words perhaps a handful of times over the years. But as he stood in the gathered crowd that Sunday afternoon, watching Briggs prepare his whip, watching Lucy tied to the post with her back bared, watching Theodore Ashford settle into a chair brought specially for his observation, something inside Solomon shifted. He thought about his mother. He thought about the letter she had drawn in the dirt. He thought about the promise he had carried for so many years without knowing what to do with it. He thought about the 23 books in their hidden cellar. He thought about the words he had learned, the sentences he could construct, the knowledge that lived in his mind where no one could see it. And he thought about Briggs's ledgers, the careful records, the names and numbers, the documentation of systematic horror maintained in the overseer's meticulous handwriting. The whip fell. Lucy screamed, and Solomon made his decision. The plan Solomon developed over the following months was audacious, complex, and dependent on factors entirely outside his control. In other words, it was the only kind of plan available to someone in his position. He would write a letter. Not just any letter, but a detailed account of conditions at Ashford Plantation, complete with names, dates, and specific incidents. He would somehow get this letter to the North, where abolitionists published newspapers and pressured politicians and created the kind of public attention that Southern slaveholders feared. The challenges were immense. He had no paper. He had no ink. He had no way to send a letter even if he could write one. He had no contacts in the North, no network of allies, no resources of any kind beyond his hidden knowledge and his determination. He began acquiring materials with the same patience he had applied to learning letters. A piece of paper here, taken from waste destined for burning. A scrap there, recovered from the main house garbage. He smoothed and flattened these fragments, storing them in the root cellar with his books. Ink was harder. He experimented with various substances. Charcoal mixed with water produced marks that smeared and faded. Berry juice was too light. Finally, he discovered that oak galls, the round growths formed when wasps lay eggs in oak bark, could be processed with iron filings from his own blacksmith shop to create a serviceable ink. The process took weeks of trial and error, conducted in stolen moments when he could be certain of privacy. A writing implement proved simpler. Goose feathers were plentiful. Solomon had watched the white children trim quills during his observation of the schoolhouse years earlier. He replicated the technique, cutting and shaping until he had several functional pens. By autumn of 1858, he had materials. Now he needed words. He began composing in his head, organizing information gathered over decades into a coherent narrative. He could not simply complain about conditions in general terms. Northerners received such reports constantly and had become numb to them. He needed specifics. He needed names. He needed details that would separate his account from the mass of similar testimony. He drew on Briggs's own methods. The overseer had demonstrated the power of precise documentation. Solomon would use that same power against the system that employed it. He wrote about the cotton quotas and how they were enforced. He wrote about the punishments, describing specific incidents with dates that anyone with access to plantation records could verify. He wrote about Theodore Ashford's nighttime visits to the quarters and named the women he targeted. He wrote about the food rations, inadequate even by the standards that Southern law supposedly guaranteed. He wrote about the infant mortality rate, the bodies of children buried in the quarter cemetery, lives that lasted weeks or months before yielding to malnutrition and neglect. He wrote about Lucy and the 40 lashes for a ham she probably didn't steal. He wrote about his mother and the shapes she drew in the dirt. He wrote about himself, about the secret education conducted over decades, about the books hidden in their cellar, about the mind that had developed in darkness, fed by stolen knowledge, burning with a truth that demanded expression. The letter grew over months. Solomon worked on it in fragments, a paragraph here, a sentence there, always alert to the possibility of discovery. He wrote with his paper hidden beneath a loose board in his cabin, his body positioned to conceal any unexpected movement from anyone who might peer through the gaps in his walls. By February 1859, the letter was nearly complete. 12 pages of cramped handwriting, covering both sides of each precious scrap of paper. 12 pages of testimony that would, if it reached the right hands, create a documentation of slavery's horrors more detailed than anything the abolition movement had yet possessed. Now Solomon faced his greatest challenge: getting the letter out. The opportunity arrived in April 1859, carried by a face Solomon had never expected to see again. James Harrington returned to Ashford Plantation, this time on business with Theodore Ashford regarding cotton shipping arrangements for the upcoming season. With him, as before, came William Still. Solomon learned of the visit by overhearing conversation in the blacksmith shop. Two white employees discussing the upcoming arrival mentioned that Harrington's Negro would be coming along. Their tone combined contempt and unease, the standard reaction to free black people in slave territory. Solomon had not forgotten William Still. He had not forgotten the whispered conversation about people who helped folks get away. He had not forgotten any of it. But how to make contact? William would be housed in the main house with his employer. Solomon had no legitimate reason to approach the building, no excuse that would not attract suspicion. And Theodore Ashford, following his father's precedent, would ensure that the free black man had minimal contact with enslaved people. Solomon thought about the problem the way he thought about shaping metal. Apply heat. Apply pressure. Be patient. Watch for the moment when the material becomes workable. The moment came on the third day of Harrington's visit. A horse in the Ashford stable threw a shoe. The horse belonged to Harrington himself, a fine bay mare that he had ridden from Vicksburg. The stablemaster brought the horse to Solomon's shop for repair, and William Still accompanied it. Solomon had perhaps 15 minutes while he worked on the horse. 15 minutes to communicate years of preparation, to establish trust with a stranger, to set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. He did not speak immediately. He worked on the horse, removing the damaged shoe, examining the hoof, selecting a replacement. William stood nearby, watching with the polite attention of someone who had nothing else to do. Finally, Solomon spoke. His voice was low, barely audible over the sound of his tools. "I can write." William's expression did not change. His body did not move. But something shifted in his eyes, a recognition, an alertness. "What did you say?" "I can write," Solomon repeated. "I have a letter. 12 pages. Names and dates. Everything that happens here. It needs to reach people who will use it." A long pause. The horse shifted its weight. The forge crackled. "You understand what you're asking," William said finally. "The risk." "I understand. I've carried this for 20 years, since I was a boy, since my mother drew letters in the dirt and told me the white folks feared them. I've carried it, and now I need to set it down somewhere it will matter." Another pause. William glanced toward the door, confirming they remained unobserved. "Where is it?" "Hidden. I can get it tonight. But I need to know if there's a way. A channel. Someone who will receive it and do something with it." William was silent for a long moment, then very slowly he nodded. "There's a newspaper in Cincinnati, the Anti-Slavery Bugle. They publish testimonies. They investigate claims. They have reach. How do I get it to them?" "You don't. You give it to me. Tonight, if possible. I'll see that it reaches the right hands." Solomon felt something shift in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or the strange combination of both that accompanies any moment of irreversible decision. Behind the quarters. "There's an old oak tree. The biggest one. Behind it there's a cellar dug into the ground, covered with boards and leaves. The letter is there, wrapped in oilcloth. Midnight tonight." William nodded again. Midnight. That night Solomon could not sleep. He lay in his cabin, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into darkness. The distant lowing of cattle, the cry of a night bird, the creak of wood cooling after the day's heat. The footsteps of the overseer's patrol, passing his cabin at the scheduled hour, continuing on. At 11:30, he rose. He moved with the practiced silence of years, slipping through his door, crossing the open ground between cabins, reaching the shadow of the great oak. He descended into the root cellar for what he hoped would be the last time. The letter was where he had left it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, hidden beneath a loose stone in the cellar floor. 12 pages. Years of work. A lifetime of suffering and observation and carefully hoarded knowledge, compressed into words on paper. He held it for a moment in the darkness. Such a small thing, such a fragile thing, such a dangerous, powerful, potentially transformative thing. Then he climbed back out of the cellar and waited. William Still arrived at midnight exactly. He moved with the same silence Solomon had cultivated, a skill that free black men in hostile territory learned quickly, or did not survive to learn at all. They did not speak. Solomon handed over the oilcloth package. William took it, tucked it inside his coat, and nodded once. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had come. Solomon returned to his cabin. He lay down on his pallet. He closed his eyes. Whatever happened now was out of his hands. The words had been released into the world. They would find their destination or they would not. They would be published or they would be suppressed. They would change things or they would vanish without trace. Solomon had done what he could do. He had transformed his secret knowledge into action. He had honored his mother's memory and fulfilled the promise he had carried since childhood. He slept better that night than he had in years. What Solomon could not know, lying in his cabin that April night, was that his letter would reach the anti-slavery Bugle in Cincinnati 6 weeks later. He could not know that the editor, a fiery abolitionist named Marius Robinson, would recognize its significance immediately. He could not know that Robinson would verify what details could be verified, contact other sources, and prepare a series of articles that would begin appearing in July 1859. He could not know that these articles would be reprinted in newspapers across the North, the New York Tribune, the Boston Liberator, the Cleveland Leader, the Chicago Tribune, papers that reached hundreds of thousands of readers, readers who would write letters to their congressmen, readers who would attend abolition meetings in greater numbers, readers who would donate money to organizations that helped enslaved people escape. He could not know that his letter would become a central document in the political battles of 1859 and 1860, cited in speeches and sermons and political debates. That his description of conditions at Ashford Plantation would be read aloud on the floor of the United States House of Representatives by a congressman from Ohio, who demanded that his Southern colleagues explain how such a system could be tolerated in a nation that claimed to value human liberty. He could not know that the letter would contribute in its small way to the mounting tensions that would explode into civil war less than 2 years later. That the words scratched onto scraps of paper in a Mississippi cabin would join the chorus of voices, written and spoken, that made the continuation of slavery politically untenable. He could not know any of this, but he had done it anyway. He had cast his words upon the waters, trusting that they would find their way, and they did. The first indication that something had changed came in August 1859, when a stranger arrived at Ashford Plantation. The stranger was a white man, middle-aged, wearing the clothes of a merchant or professional. He arrived in a hired carriage from Vicksburg and asked to speak with Theodore Ashford on a matter of urgent business. Solomon learned of the visit through the usual channels of plantation information, the whispered communications that passed between kitchen and fields, between stable and quarters. The stranger had come from Memphis, people said. He represented certain business interests concerned about recent newspaper reports. Theodore Ashford received the stranger in his study. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When the stranger departed, Theodore was observed drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, a level of consumption excessive even by his standards. That evening, he summoned Overseer Briggs. The consequences of whatever they discussed became apparent over the following days. Briggs began questioning workers systematically, asking about letters, about reading, about any suspicious behavior observed among their fellows. The interrogations were accompanied by threats and occasional violence, Briggs's standard method of extracting information. But no one knew anything. Solomon's secret had been kept too well, held too closely. Not even the other enslaved people at Ashford knew about the hidden cellar, the stolen books, the years of careful study. There was nothing to tell, because there was nothing they could tell. This lack of results seemed to frustrate Briggs, but it also seemed to convince him. He reported to Theodore that the investigation had produced no evidence of literate slaves on the property. The letter, he speculated, must have been written by someone outside, perhaps an abolitionist spy who had visited the plantation in some innocuous capacity and fabricated allegations based on limited observation. Theodore accepted this explanation. It fit his worldview, which held that black people were inherently incapable of the intellectual achievement the letter demonstrated. Better to believe in an external conspiracy than to admit that someone he owned had outthought him. But suspicion lingered. And suspicion, on a plantation, was its own kind of danger. The autumn of 1859 brought new restrictions to Ashford Plantation. Theodore Ashford, shaken by the newspaper coverage and the visits from concerned business associates, implemented what he called security measures. Movement between different areas of the plantation was limited and tracked. Workers were required to report their locations at specific intervals throughout the day. The quarters were patrolled more frequently, at irregular hours designed to catch anyone engaged in nighttime activities. Most significantly, a thorough search was conducted of every cabin, every outbuilding, every possible hiding place on the entire property. Solomon had anticipated this. In the weeks after passing his letter to William Still, he had gradually disposed of his writing materials, burning them in his forge a little at a time. He had considered the books, his precious books, that had been his teachers for so many years, and made the painful decision to destroy them as well. He returned to the root cellar on a moonless night and carried the books out one by one. He could not bring himself to burn them in his forge, where their destruction would be witnessed by flame and smoke. Instead, he weighted them with stones and sank them in the deepest part of the creek that ran through the plantation's northern boundary. He kept only one book, the primer with its simple illustrations. A is for apple, B is for ball, the book that had started everything. He buried it in a location he would remember, marking the spot with a particular arrangement of stones. When the search came, they found nothing. Solomon's cabin was as bare and simple as any other. His possessions were the possessions of any enslaved blacksmith, a few extra clothes, some tools of his trade, nothing that suggested hidden knowledge or dangerous capability. The searchers passed him by. The suspicion remained, but without evidence, it could not crystallize into accusation. Solomon continued his work at the forge. He continued his performance of simplicity and contentment. He continued waiting to see what his words would do in the world. News of the letter's impact reached the quarters in fragments, whispered stories that passed from plantation to plantation along the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities throughout the South. A newspaper in the North had published something about Mississippi, something about a specific plantation where conditions were bad even by the standards of a system built on badness. Names had been mentioned. Overseers had been identified. A master had been characterized in terms that made other masters nervous. The white folks were upset. This was apparent from their behavior, from the increased patrols, from the harsh reactions to minor infractions, from the general atmosphere of siege that had settled over Ashford Plantation. Among the enslaved, reactions were mixed. Some were frightened. Attention brought danger, and attention from Northern abolitionists brought the most dangerous kind. Masters who felt threatened might sell off their human property, breaking families that had existed for generations. They might increase restrictions, making already unbearable conditions even worse. But others felt something different, something like hope. Someone had spoken. Someone had found a way to make the outside world see what happened inside these boundaries of cotton and cruelty. Someone had proven that the system was not as total, not as complete, not as unassailable as it presented itself. Solomon listened to these whispered conversations and said nothing. He continued his performance. He continued waiting. And then, in October 1859, everything changed again. John Brown attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry on October 16, 1859. His goal was to seize weapons and spark a massive slave uprising across the South. His failure was complete, his execution a foregone conclusion, but his action sent shockwaves through every slaveholding state. In Mississippi, planters armed themselves. Patrols were strengthened. Suspected abolitionists were driven out of communities, sometimes violently. Any black person, free or enslaved, who showed signs of unusual knowledge or capability, came under immediate suspicion. At Ashford Plantation, Theodore Ashford convened a meeting of neighboring planters to discuss collective security measures. The meeting took place in the main house, and its proceedings were, as usual, reported through the whisper networks to the quarters. The planters agreed to share information about suspicious persons and activities. They agreed to coordinate their patrols. They agreed to punish any signs of literacy among enslaved people with the most extreme measures available. And they discussed the letter that had appeared in northern newspapers some months earlier. The letter from Ashford Plantation. The letter that remained, to Theodore's continuing fury, unattributed to any specific source. One of the planters suggested that the letter's author must have been among the enslaved population. The level of detail, the specific knowledge of plantation operations, the references to particular incidents and individuals, all pointed to an inside source. Theodore rejected this theory. His slaves were ignorant, he insisted, incapable of such composition. The letter was clearly the work of an outside agitator, someone who had gathered information through deception and composed the document elsewhere. But the other planters were not convinced. The letter had the quality of lived experience, one of them observed. It read like testimony, not fabrication. The meeting concluded without resolution, but Solomon, hearing reports of it later, understood that his danger had increased. The connection between the letter and Harper's Ferry, in the fevered minds of men who saw abolition conspiracies everywhere, transformed a newspaper embarrassment into evidence of potential rebellion. If they ever discovered the truth, they would not simply punish him. They would make of him an example so terrible that no one would ever again dare to pick up a pen. Winter came early in 1859, bringing cold rains that turned the roads to mud and confined everyone to limited movement. Solomon used this time to think about what might come next. His letter had achieved more than he had ever realistically hoped. It had been published. It had been read. It had contributed to the growing crisis that was pulling the nation toward confrontation over slavery. He had added his voice to the chorus, and the chorus was growing louder. But his own situation remained unchanged. He was still enslaved. He was still subject to the whims of Theodore Ashford and the cruelties of Samuel Briggs. He was still trapped in a system that his letter had exposed, but had not broken. Should he try to escape? The thought had occurred to him many times over the years, but he had always rejected it. Escape was incredibly dangerous, success rates were low, and failure meant punishments worse than the conditions he already endured. Moreover, he had responsibilities. Others depended on him, looked to him, drew strength from his quiet steadiness. But circumstances had changed. The letter had made him, unknowingly to his captors, but knowingly to himself, a different kind of person. A person who had acted against the system rather than simply endured it. A person who had already committed an act for which discovery would mean death. Perhaps escape was not so risky after all, considered against that baseline. He began to pay attention to different things. Routes north, sympathetic contacts, the Underground Railroad, which everyone knew existed, but which operated in such secrecy that its actual pathways remained hidden to those who had not been trusted with them. He thought about William Still, now returned to Cincinnati, carrying not just his letter but knowledge of Solomon's abilities. Perhaps William would help again if Solomon could find a way to reach him. Perhaps the same networks that had carried his words could carry his body. But all of this was speculation. Winter held everyone in place. The roads were impassable. Movement was tracked and restricted. Any attempt would have to wait for spring. Solomon waited. He had become very good at waiting. Spring 1860 brought new developments on multiple fronts. Nationally, the political situation was deteriorating. The Democratic Party had split over slavery. Abraham Lincoln was emerging as the likely Republican candidate for president. Southern politicians were openly discussing secession if Lincoln won. The country was sliding toward a crisis that everyone could see coming, but no one seemed able to prevent. At Ashford Plantation, a different kind of crisis was developing. Theodore Ashford's finances were troubled. Years of high living, gambling debts, and poor management had eroded the wealth his father had accumulated. He owed money to banks in Vicksburg and New Orleans. His cotton yields had declined as the soil grew exhausted from decades of intensive cultivation without proper rotation. In April, a representative from one of his creditors visited the plantation. The meeting was brief, and the representative departed with a grim expression. Soon after, rumors began circulating that Theodore might be forced to sell off some of his property to satisfy his debts. For enslaved people, such rumors carried a special terror. Being sold meant separation from family, from community, from everything familiar. It meant starting over in a new place where the masters and the conditions were unknown quantities. It meant the destruction of the fragile relationships and small routines that made unbearable lives slightly more bearable. The quarters buzzed with anxious speculation. Who would be sold? Families were torn between hoping they would be kept together and hoping they would not be chosen at all. Young men considered escape with renewed urgency. Old women prayed with renewed fervor. Solomon listened and calculated. If Theodore needed to raise money quickly, he would sell his most valuable property first. Skilled workers like blacksmiths commanded premium prices. Solomon might well find himself on the auction block in Vicksburg or Natchez, purchased by some unknown buyer, transported to some unknown location. His years of planning and knowledge carried into a situation where they might mean nothing. unless he acted first. The decision to escape crystallized on a May evening when Overseer Briggs announced that a slave trader from New Orleans would be visiting the plantation in 2 weeks to assess potential purchases. The announcement was made at the evening assembly, delivered in Briggs's flat voice that transformed human beings into inventory items to be evaluated and priced. Names were not mentioned, but everyone understood that the assessment would determine who would be torn from their community, who would make the terrible journey downriver, who would disappear into the vast system of slavery never to be heard from again. That night, Solomon retrieved the buried primer from its hiding place. He held the small book in his hands, feeling its weight, remembering the first time he had puzzled out its lessons in the darkness of his cabin. A is for apple, B is for ball, C is for cat. 23 letters ago, he had been a young man with a secret and a dream. Now he was a man who had made that dream real, who had sent words into the world that were still echoing, still causing trouble, still contributing to forces that were reshaping history. He could not let himself be sold. He could not let all of that become meaningless. He could not let his mother's memory, and the shapes she had drawn in the dirt, and the promise he had carried, end on an auction block in New Orleans. He began to make preparations. Not openly, not in any way that would attract attention, but with the same careful patience he had applied to every challenge since childhood. He started setting aside small amounts of food that would travel well. He repaired his strongest pair of shoes, replacing worn soles with new leather from the blacksmith shop supplies. He observed patrol patterns with new intensity, identifying the gaps and weaknesses that a careful person might exploit. And he began reaching out, very cautiously, to others who might want to leave. There were 5 of them in the end. Solomon, a young woman named Patience who worked in the main house kitchen and had access to information about roads and routes from overheard conversations. 2 brothers, Isaiah and Jacob, strong young men who worked in the fields and had no families to leave behind. And an older man named Marcus, who had been a sailor before his capture decades earlier and understood navigation by stars. They met in whispers, in stolen moments, in the gaps between surveillance. They shared information. They made plans. They agreed on a date, the new moon in late May, when darkness would be most complete. The route they would take led north through Mississippi into Tennessee, then across the Ohio River, into free territory. It was hundreds of miles of hostile country, filled with patrols and slave catchers and ordinary citizens who might turn them in for the reward. The odds of success were perhaps 1 in 10, maybe worse. But they had decided. Better to die trying than to be sold south, separated from everything and everyone, ground down into anonymous labor on some distant plantation where no one knew their names. Solomon shared one more thing with his fellow conspirators. He told them about the letter. He told them about his ability to read and write. He told them that if they made it to freedom, his skills might help them build new lives, might help them assist others still in bondage, might transform their escape from mere flight into something larger. They listened with wonder. Even among people who had lived with him for years, his secret had remained complete. The man they thought they knew was not who they had imagined. "Why?" Patience asked when he finished. "Why tell us now?" Solomon considered the question. Why indeed? He had kept this secret so long, guarded it so carefully. Why reveal it to people he barely knew, on the eve of an attempt that might well fail? "Because if we get caught," he said finally, "I want someone to know. Someone to remember. Even if I'm dead and the letter is forgotten and everything goes back to how it was, I want someone to know that I did this, that I was more than what they saw." They understood. In a system that denied their humanity, the assertion of hidden capability was itself a form of resistance. The secret had been Solomon's weapon. Sharing it was his way of passing that weapon on. The escape began at midnight on May 24th, 1860. The new moon had delivered on its promise of darkness, and a layer of clouds added an additional blessing of concealment. The 5 fugitives gathered at the prearranged meeting point, behind the great oak tree where Solomon had once hidden his books. They carried almost nothing. A little food, a knife each, the clothes on their backs. Solomon carried one additional item, the primer, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked against his body. He could not bear to leave it behind. Marcus led the way, his old sailor's knowledge guiding them north by the stars that occasionally showed through gaps in the cloud cover. They moved in single file, keeping to the tree line, avoiding roads, wading through streams to break any trail that dogs might follow. The first night, they covered approximately 15 miles. At dawn, they found a thicket dense enough to hide them and collapsed into exhausted sleep, taking turns keeping watch. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of hiding and moving, fear and determination. They traveled only at night. They ate sparingly. They spoke rarely, communicating through gestures and whispers. On the third night, they heard dogs in the distance. The baying sound, familiar from plantation life where runaways were hunted with terrible regularity, sent ice through their veins. They ran, abandoning caution for speed, plunging through underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. The dogs came closer. Solomon could hear men's voices now, shouting commands, crashing through vegetation. They were being hunted. Marcus made a decision. "Split up," he whispered urgently. "Meet at the river crossing we talked about. Go. Go now." They scattered in different directions. Solomon ran alone into the darkness, the sounds of pursuit fading behind him. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs screamed, until he could run no more. Then he found a hollow log and crawled inside, pressing himself into the rotting wood, becoming as still as the forest around him. The dogs passed nearby. Solomon held his breath. He could hear them snuffling, confused by the multiple trails. The handlers cursed. Eventually, the sounds moved away in a different direction. Solomon remained in the log until dawn, until silence had held for hours, until he felt reasonably certain he had not been discovered. Then he emerged, oriented himself by the rising sun, and continued north. He would learn later that they had been betrayed. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. The patrols had been waiting for them. Marcus was captured that first night and returned to Ashford Plantation, where he was beaten so severely that he never fully recovered. Isaiah and Jacob made it 3 more days before being caught near the Tennessee border. Patience was taken on the second night, barely 5 miles from where they had started. Solomon alone escaped. The journey to freedom took Solomon 11 weeks. 11 weeks of walking at night and hiding by day. 11 weeks of stolen food and dangerous river crossings and the constant weight of fear. 11 weeks of moving north, always north, toward the Ohio River and the promise of free territory beyond. He received help along the way. The Underground Railroad was real, and its stations were scattered throughout the slave states, operated by free black people and sympathetic whites who risked everything to assist fugitives. Solomon learned the signals, the passwords, the subtle signs that identified safe houses. He learned to trust people he had never met and would never see again. In July, he crossed the Ohio River on a moonless night, ferried by a fisherman who asked no questions and accepted no payment. He stepped onto Indiana soil in the early hours of morning, the first free land his feet had ever touched. The sensation was strange. The ground looked the same as the ground in Mississippi. The trees were similar. The air smelled of river and growing things, as it had smelled back home. But something was different, something he could feel but not name. The weight that had pressed on him since birth, so constant he had stopped noticing it, was suddenly lighter. He wept. For the first time since his mother's death, he wept. Great shuddering sobs that shook his body and brought him to his knees on the free bank of the Ohio River. When the tears passed, he rose and continued north. He had survived. He had escaped. But his journey was not over. He had letters to write, people to contact, a cause to serve. The words that had started everything were still echoing in the world, and Solomon intended to add more. Solomon arrived in Cincinnati in early August 1860. The city was a revelation. Streets crowded with people of all colors, some of them black men and women moving freely, conducting business, owning property, living lives that would have been impossible in Mississippi. He found William Still, who had returned to the city after his travels. The reunion was emotional. William had wondered for more than a year what had happened to the enslaved man who had handed him a letter in a Mississippi blacksmith shop. Now he knew. "Your words did good work," William told Solomon. "More than you can imagine. The articles were read everywhere. They changed minds. They moved people." Solomon listened, gratified, but not satisfied. One letter was not enough. The system that had held him still held millions of others. His friends who had tried to escape with him were back in chains, probably suffering for their attempt. The work was far from finished. "I want to write more," Solomon said. "I want to tell everything. Not just the conditions, but how I learned, how I hid it, how I escaped. I want people to understand that we are not what they say we are, that our minds are as sharp as theirs, that given opportunity, we can do anything they can do." William nodded. "There are people who will help you, publishers, abolitionists. They've been looking for someone like you." And so began the second phase of Solomon's story. Over the following months, Solomon composed a full narrative of his life. His birth at Ashford Plantation, his mother's instruction, the hidden education, the years of concealment, the letter, the escape. He wrote with the skill he had developed in secret, but also with a raw honesty that no amount of practice could manufacture. The narrative was published in early 1861, just as the nation was tearing itself apart over the very issue that had shaped Solomon's entire existence. It appeared first in serial form in abolitionist newspapers, then as a small book with the title, Letters from Bondage, The True Account of Solomon Ashford. The book was not as widely read as some slave narratives. The timing was poor, arriving just as war demanded everyone's attention. But it found its audience. It was read by people who needed to understand what they were fighting for. It was cited in sermons and speeches. It became one more drop in the ocean of testimony that documented slavery's horror. And it accomplished something that Solomon had always dreamed of, from the days when his mother drew shapes in the dirt and told him the white folks feared the knowing. It proved that an enslaved man, given no resources, no education, no opportunity, could teach himself to read and write, could compose documents that influenced national politics, could escape from bondage through intelligence rather than just strength, could become fully human in the eyes of people who had been taught to deny his humanity. The mocking that the title referenced was real. Master Ashford had called him simple as an ox. Overseer Briggs had recorded him in the ledgers as average intelligence, suitable for physical labor. The whole system had been designed to convince Solomon, and everyone like him, that he was incapable of intellectual achievement. The letter proved them wrong. The war came as everyone had known it would. Solomon, too old for military service but determined to contribute, worked with organizations that assisted escaped slaves reaching Union lines. He taught literacy to freed people, sharing the skills he had acquired so painfully with those who could now learn openly. He wrote letters for men and women searching for family members separated by slavery's cruelties. He corresponded with abolitionists, military officers, government officials, adding his voice to the chorus demanding not just victory, but justice. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war from a fight for union into a fight for freedom, Solomon wept again. He was living in Philadelphia by then, boarding with a family of free black people who had welcomed him into their community. He read the proclamation in a newspaper, read Lincoln's words, read the promise of freedom for millions still in bondage. He thought of Ashford Plantation. He thought of the people still there, the old folks who had watched him grow up, the children born since his escape, the friends whose attempted flight had ended in recapture and punishment. The proclamation did not free them. Not yet. Mississippi was still Confederate territory, still beyond the reach of Union authority. But the promise was made. The direction was set. The walls of the system that had held them were cracking. He wrote a letter to a newspaper editor, one of many letters he composed during the war years. In it, he described his feelings on reading the proclamation. "I have carried words with me all my life. First as secrets, then as weapons, now as tools of freedom. I taught myself to read in darkness because they told me reading belonged only to them. I taught myself to write because writing is how the powerless make themselves heard. And now I read these words from our president, words that declare my people free, and I understand that every letter I traced in the dirt of a Mississippi cabin was leading to this moment. Not just my moment, all of our moments. The moment when America finally begins to live up to its promises." The letter was published. It was read. It was remembered. The war ended in April 1865. The Confederacy surrendered. Slavery was abolished throughout the nation. 4 million people who had been property became, on paper at least, citizens. Solomon was 59 years old. He had been free for 5 years, had contributed what he could to the cause, had seen the system that had shaped his life destroyed by the war's terrible arithmetic of blood and suffering. He did not celebrate. He was not capable of celebration, not really, not after everything. The weight he had carried his whole life, though lighter now, had not fully lifted. It never would. The scars, physical and otherwise, were permanent. But he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel. Satisfaction. Not joy. Satisfaction. The satisfaction of having done something that mattered, of having contributed to a victory that seemed, for so long, impossible. He thought about returning to Mississippi. The war's end made such a journey theoretically possible. He could go back to Ashford Plantation, could see what had become of the place, could perhaps find the people he had known. But he decided against it. The plantation represented the past, and Solomon had spent his whole life oriented toward the future. He had work still to do. Freed people needed education. They needed assistance navigating a society that had never acknowledged their full humanity. They needed people who could read and write and teach others to do the same. He stayed in Philadelphia. He taught in a school for freed people, one of many such schools that opened across the country in the war's aftermath. He continued writing, producing essays and articles and letters that documented both the horrors of the past and the possibilities of the future. And he told his story, to students, to visitors, to anyone who wanted to understand what slavery had meant, what it had cost, how it had been resisted. They mocked me because I couldn't read, he would say. They were so certain of their superiority, so confident that the system they had built was permanent and complete. But they were wrong. They were wrong about me, and they were wrong about all of us. We were always more than they wanted to see. If you watch this far, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Solomon died in 1879, at the age of 73. He had lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction, and also to see that promise betrayed. He had lived long enough to vote in a presidential election, and also to see the rights of black citizens systematically dismantled across the South. He had lived long enough to know that the struggle was far from over. His obituary in a Philadelphia newspaper called him a self-made man in the truest sense of the word, who rose from the depths of bondage to make a lasting contribution to the cause of human freedom. It mentioned his book, his teaching, his letters that had been published in newspapers across the nation. It mentioned the students he had taught, many of whom went on to careers as teachers themselves, spreading literacy and possibility through communities that had been denied both for generations. The obituary did not mention the primer he had kept all his life, the small book with its simple illustrations that had been his first teacher. A is for apple, B is for ball. He had donated it, years earlier, to a museum in Cincinnati that collected artifacts related to the abolition movement. It remains there still, protected behind glass, a testament to what one person can accomplish with determination and 26 letters of the alphabet. Like this video if Solomon's story touched your heart. Share this so that Solomon's memory is never forgotten. Today, if you visit the site of the former Ashford Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, you will find the ruins mentioned at the beginning of this story. The main house burned during the war, set alight by Union soldiers during a raid in 1864. Only the columns and a single chimney stack remain, wrapped in vegetation, slowly returning to the earth. The quarters where enslaved people lived are entirely gone. No trace remains of the cabins, the fire pits, the garden plots, the spaces where generations were born and labored and died. The land has been reclaimed by forest, the same land that once produced cotton watered by the sweat and tears of human beings treated as property. But the oak tree still stands, the one they called the Judgment Oak, though no one remembers why anymore. Its branches spread wide, providing shade in summer and skeletal beauty in winter. Its bark carries scars that might be from chains or might be from age. Its roots still drink from soil that holds memories. And somewhere nearby, buried in a location that Solomon alone knew, lies the empty root cellar where he hid his books for 20 years. The books are gone, sunk in a creek, rotted into nothingness. But the space remains, a hollow in the earth where knowledge once waited for someone brave enough to claim it. Solomon's letter is preserved in archives now, the original pages, those precious scraps of paper covered with his careful handwriting, survived the war and the years that followed. Scholars study them, students read transcriptions in history classes. The words that Solomon traced in secret, risking his life with every stroke, continue to speak across the centuries. They mocked the slave who couldn't read. They were wrong. He could read. He could write. He could think and plan and endure and escape. He could change history with 12 pages and a quill made from a goose feather. The letter that changed everything still exists because Solomon existed, because he refused to accept the limitations others placed on him, because he trusted that words had power, and he was right. This is his legacy. Not just freedom for himself, but proof of what was possible. Proof that the system was built on a lie. Proof that human beings, no matter how oppressed, will find ways to resist. And proof that sometimes a single letter can change everything.